Hello and welcome to episode 52 of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. And 52 reminds me of DC Comics. I just talked a bit about DC Comics the other day when I was talking about Jack Kirby's New Gods. But 52, they used that number so many times. But then there was a series called 52. And the most memorable part, I'm going to spoil a couple of different things for my millions of fans out there. You may not have read 52 or any of the other things I'm going to reference. But 52 had one of my favorite moments. There's so much plot in that story that it's hard to remember all the different plots in that story, and ultimately it doesn't matter because DC's constantly rebooting, so the long-lasting impact of any story is kind of mitigated by the fact that just a few years later, none of it really matters. But it just, as a standalone story, it's a pretty great story. But they took a lot of relatively minor characters and really highlighted them. I always like that sort of idea. Like my "Oh God in the Broken Heart" story started that way, where there are these minor characters, and I still treat them that way as minor characters. What happens to these minor characters when the major characters are out of the story? But the idea of 52 was Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman are gone for various reasons. It's a whole complicated thing. So one of the spotlight characters is Black Adam, who is one of Shazam's one of his main villains. And Black Adam always had kind of a complicated moral landscape. He's supposedly going to be played by The Rock in some movie at some point. Who knows with DC movies? But the way the plot pans out is it's sort of one of his moments of trying to straighten himself up and trying to do right, and he gets a family. Isis and her brother Osiris, and a pet crocodile named Sobek. So here's the spoiler. Sobek just brutally murders Osiris, eats him, and is really, really, really vicious and disturbing. So that really makes me think about when death really becomes an impactful thing, especially in comics. It tends to not have a whole lot of impact. Partly because, hey man, what's that? My dogs are in a great mood because I just fed them. You in a great mood? I'm talking about pets who kill their owners. I need to talk about horror stories pretty soon, I'm sure. This is kind of a horrific story. But the nature of horror stories is that, it's a schematic issue because, schema being the third level, schema being level 3, but it's a 1, 2, 3. But it's a schematic issue because in a horror story, it's just the schematic nature of the story that you're going to expect some sort of violence. Usually the way the violence pans out, if you think about really horrific deaths in horror stories, they tend to just be part of, just par for the course, really. If you think of Thrasher movies, just as an example, it tends to present characters of mixed relatability with lots of problems where if you do see them get killed, it has a lot of visceral impact. I'm trying not to say the word impactful. It has a lot of visceral impact, but because they're terrible people or because they do these quote-unquote bad things, I'm not saying they're actually bad, but that's sort of how they're presented. They do these quote-unquote bad things, then they quote-unquote deserve to die. I don't really necessarily fall into that, but that's sort of the dynamic of the slasher movie. So when you have this sudden, violent, horrific death to this character you're not really attached to, who's not all that sympathetic, the impact is purely visceral. It spikes that visceral impact, but then it sort of just floats away. But if you have just a sudden, unexpected death of a character, it can have much more impact. Like, Osiris as a character, just in the sequence of that story, Osiris was becoming really sympathetic. He was kind of a complicated guy, but he was becoming more sympathetic. Black Adam is certainly a sympathetic character, even though morally complicated. Sobek, is kind of this goofy pet crocodile that they had. And so you can do a story like that where it feels really forced. My pet is now trying to eat me. Your teeth are sharp. Ow. You are not Sobek, so don't try to eat me. You could do that where it feels really forced. And part of the problem with that really forced sort of sudden death for the sake of just shock value and nothing else goes back to the Rainbow Circle. My friend, the Rainbow Circle, can explain pretty much anything in stories. What you want is something organic and inevitable, and that's kind of the really tricky thing to really handle effectively. It needs to feel organic. If it needs to feel inevitable, it needs to feel like it's destined to be part of the story regardless. And that's why, not forcing things in there, not killing off a character. Primarily what you need to do is just discover this character needs to die. And I had that struggle in my novel, The Upholstery Man. I went back and forth with the editor. I knew particular characters needed to die. They needed to die suddenly and violently. My editor did not agree. So a bit of a, back and forth about that. I won't say who won on that one. However, it was just, writing a story, you discover, unfortunately, based on the story, it's nothing I decide on, and it should really hurt. It should really hurt. It should be something that you can't avoid. And it should hurt you as a writer, but it's just something that, just seeing how the story is, the way the story's panning out, you just have to kill off the character. And 52 is a really simple example of that, because Sobek is a pet crocodile. So you have a pet crocodile. And also, they set up this other plot. There's another spoiler for the story. They set up this other plot about the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse, which is kind of a Marvel gimmick too. I'm not really a DC person, so I was like, it seems kind of like a Marvel gimmick. And this is something I was talking about a couple of episodes ago, where if something seems unoriginal, that can be an excuse not to read it. I think it worked just fine, even though, it's definitely a Marvel gimmick. In this particular story, the Four Horsemen thing didn't play out as being overly derivative to the degree that it reduced my enjoyment of it. It was a really interesting plot point. And so one of the twists was that Sobek was never a nice pet. He was a crocodile. He was never a nice pet. He was always a vicious murderer, and he was one of the Four Horsemen. He was famine. All of that stuff, was set up elsewhere, and it folded together in such an organic way that it didn't really feel cheap and forced. If you look at the Rainbow Circle, the outer edge is the destimulating end of the spectrum that has to do with overt control over, the structure of the text, which has the potential to eliminate the visceral stimulation. So if you're forcing in just something that's shocking for the sake of being shocking, and it feels like it's forced and manipulative, that can undermine the actual impact of it. And the perfect example of that, I just finished with my son the audiobook of Prisoner of Azkaban. We're about to start Goblet of Fire, which has a really significant death in the climax of that one. But Prisoner of Azkaban is really effectively structured. I mentioned at one point it's like the perfectly structured book. I forgot. I was conscious of this as I was listening to it this time. Are there really any plot holes? I totally forgot about any plot holes. And I think plot holes are really only an issue when you dislike the story. That's the post-rationalization telling you that the reason I disliked that was the plot hole, whereas the reason you dislike it is probably something much more irrational and visceral. I love Prisoner of Azkaban, so I forgot about a couple of plot holes. They're not actual flaws in the story. Um, and there are things that you could easily fix so as not to be distracting or anything like that. Like, why does Lupin go out when the moon is full? Why is he taking, you know, spoiling some of this too, but why is he taking Peter Pettigrew back to the castle when it's nighttime and the moon is full? That's kind of a plot hole, but it's such a great scene that you forgive that plot hole. But all of the different elements are ultimately, there's a lot of twists that are just really perfectly crafted, like all the Peter Pettigrew stuff. The way that, and I noticed a lot more, just I hadn't read it in so long that I noticed a lot more. I might have noticed the first time, but I noticed even more significantly this time. Like, what are you barking at? What are you barking at? You hush. So, you think you're Sirius Black now? Are you Sirius Black? Are you Sirius Black? You hush up with that barking. So, you're more like Fang. So, yes, I love you. So, my little Crookshanks, my little Fang. You gotta hush. I'm trying to make a video, so hush. So, like a lot of the stuff, it's inevitable. It's inevitable and organic, and that's the thing about a twist. Whether it's a sudden, shocking death or anything like that, like all of the different Peter Pettigrew stuff is just seeded in there, just constantly. So many different little clues that you wouldn't be able to catch on to if you didn't know. You're totally taking the rat for granted. The thing about the time travel, that's such a dodgy sort of plot twist always to use. Approach time travel with caution because it can ruin a story easily, but it works just perfectly well, and it's really seated in there just in such a fantastic way. And so, but in book 4, the death at the end of that wasn't spoiler on all of this stuff, of course. I'm assuming my millions of fans probably have already read these books. But Cedric Diggory, right at the end. There's so many of the books, 1 through 3, there's so many moments where he just comes really close. Harry comes really close to death. That when somebody actually dies, it's both shocking because we've become used to people narrowly avoiding death. But it's also organic and inevitable. It doesn't feel like something that's forced and shocking necessarily. Whereas if you compare that, spoiler alert on book 7, and this is a death that's always bothered me, when Hedwig blows up. That one feels really gratuitous. Because, Cedric dying, some kid was going to die in that book eventually just because of how much death shows up in the books, how many deaths were narrowly avoided, how many deaths came in the past. Somebody was, it feels inevitable, but somebody would, it just happened to be Cedric being the first one in book 4. But then, why'd you have to blow up the owl? I guess I love animals so much. Whoa, why do you have to knock this over every time? I love animals so much, even though at moments like this, they test my love for them. I love animals so much. That one feels especially gratuitous. The sun's getting suddenly very bright. I love animals so much. That one feels especially gratuitous. And that one feels like it really is just there for shock value. It feels like a manipulation by J.K. Rowling. So much about that book is great, but that's just one part of book 7 that I've always hated. Feels super gratuitous. But that is an example, just a real basic example of where it just feels like it's, forced shock value sort of a death. But you have a lot of examples and things I've talked about in previous episodes, like Mother. I talked about that. It feels earned as long as you're not thinking of the whole environmentalist metaphor. Then it feels really obnoxious. The super violent death feels really obnoxious when it happens. In Hereditary, it's very sudden. I've talked about Hereditary um, many episodes ago. It feels shocking and very sudden. And it's not one that is really organic and inevitable because it comes really, the first really violent death comes really early. But once and it is awkward and forced a bit, but it's such a great movie. Um, but once you get a greater sense of what the whole story is, in retrospect, it does feel organic and inevitable. Um, or Jude the Obscure, I talked about that. That's one where it's a really extremely shocking death at the end of that book. A couple of deaths, extremely shocking death at the end of those books, but they feel really organic and inevitable, just based on uh, the the pattern of the book as it was up until that point. The setup of certain characters. I'm holding off on spoiling that one, I guess, but um, Father Time Folly, just the nature of him as a character. Uh, you get the sense that there's his existential crisis, his deep core nihilism reflects a lot of the nihilism that Jude himself shows. I mean, that's what makes him such a compelling character. I think that's what I talked about when I talked about Jude the Obscure many episodes ago. What really makes him such a compelling character is that he has this deep seated nihilism on the one hand, but he has this hopeless optimism on the other hand. And the hopeless optimism forces him to keep going in this direction that everybody's telling him is the wrong direction. And Father Time Folly is such a super darkly nihilistic sort of a character. He's like this part of Jude that he's pushed down and denied about himself that suddenly manifests as a human being. So what's gonna happen when that sort of character gets introduced to this family that is everybody says is unnatural and aberrant in so many ways? Um, Nothing good's gonna happen out of that. So it feels inevitable. One thing I talked about with Jude the Obscure is how that's not we don't read that as a judgment on things that we don't condemn anymore, like having children outside of marriage is not something we condemn anymore. At the time they would. That's partly what makes it aberrant. They're also cousins. That also makes it aberrant. But um, at the time it would be considered aberrant. Um, but it's such an impactful. I keep saying that word. It's such an impactful death that partly because of the empathy that you feel for the character, and I think that's one of the keys. Is um, the Thrasher movie deaths have less long lasting impact. They have to protect the house from random dogs outside. The Thrasher movie deaths, they have less of a long lasting impact because you don't connect with the characters or feel empathy for the characters necessary, or less so. Um, but Sobek and Osiris, the way that they wrote 52, all of these DC architects, Jeff Johns and that whole crew, whoever was responsible for the Sobek section, but the way they wrote those characters, they were empathetic, they were going on the right track, and then suddenly there's that shift. And then Jude the Obscure, they're going on the right track, they're really struggling, but you always have hope because Jude is such a hopeful character. And then you have that shift. Are my dogs destroying something? That's something I always have to listen out for. Are my dogs destroying something? But anyway. So, keep that in mind. That's how the spectrum really works in that particular case, because, the overt control seems really compelling as a way to really control the story and increase the impact. But overt control can really kill impact if you're trying to manipulate the audience to increase the impact. That very frequently is counterproductive. Whereas if you discover that there's this twisted sort of death that you can't really avoid, that feels terrible, and is just something that is inevitable about the story, that's when it's going to have the most impact on the audience as well. So, on that cheery note, have a good day. See you in the next episode.